Hello everyone, welcome back to the new news. My name is Paul and I hope that everyone is having a fantastic day. I hope that you've had a last wonderful couple of days and had a restful Sunday. I hope that you, your family, and your friends are safe, and if not, I do hope that you find that safety and security in the very near future. As you can see, there is a ton of stuff happening in the news over the past 48 hours. There's been a ton of stuff that has happened inside of Ukraine, inside of Iran, as well as many other nations throughout the world and many other places. And there is currently, usually when it comes to the news, there's usually not a whole lot of good stuff. It's usually pretty terrible stuff that makes the news. A lot of suffering, a lot of crises, a lot of conflicts, and a lot of that just general kind of depressing stuff, right? In fact, we go out of our way to try and find some interesting or uplifting things to end the night on. But luckily, you guys have created a community that allows us to be the news that gives back. And the way that we're able to do that is through you guys. If you check out the video description, you're going to see a ton of different organizations down there. All of them have been vetted by us, and 80% or more of all the donations that those organizations do receive go directly to their programs, meaning they go to help people and not to their salary and administration's costs. So please be sure to check them all out. They cover the entire span of the globe. If you want to support the war effort in Ukraine, if you want to support humanitarian efforts or reconstruction, that's down there. If you want to support what's going on in the Horn of Africa, if you want to support what's going on down there in Southeast Asia, you can do that. If you want to support cancer research, you can do that as well. And if you have more, please feel free to send them to us. We are constantly looking to add more to that list. We constantly would like more to vet. We just got done vetting the whole bunch of batch, a whole different batch, which we ended up adding about a week and a half ago to the stream. And we would love to get more from you guys. So please jump onto our Discord and let a staff member know. Send us a link and a short description of what that organization does, and we'll start that vetting process right away. Likewise, you can also follow us and shoot us a message or a tweet on Twitter. You can also, of course, get a hold of us. All of the staff emails are actually posted. We have official emails. They're all posted on our website. The link's also in the video description. You also find this map on the website as well as any articles written by myself or the others that are on there. So feel free to go and check all of that stuff out. If you can't give a lot to these organizations, give a little. If you can't give anything at all, that's okay too. Help us grow this channel, grow our impact. The more people that come here, the more of an impact we will end up having as a community, as a organization here. And so please give us that like, give us that subscribe. Not something I really like asking for, but it helps the channel tremendously. It helps the project tremendously, and it has grown significantly. We're up to 316 subscribers now, which is pretty crazy to me. It's pretty awesome to have grown this fast, and to this many people who think that this project is worth continuing. So thank you very much for allowing us to do this, and please give a big thank you to the staff who actually make this happen. I do a little bit of research, but I provide my voice and I provide the map, and that's about it. The real people that were behind this is a whole team of staff members that make this thing happen. So make sure to give them your thanks for it, because they do a lot of work. And yeah, so as we get ready to go into the news here, please, if you were watching live with us tonight, please feel free to ask questions. I am checking the live chat so that way I can see questions and comments as they come through. I already see that Nikita has provided one of his famous Army Commander Conscriptovich quotes, which I will get to when we get to the news. But please, ask questions. A lot of this stuff is complicated. Unfortunately, a lot of it is conflict that's happening, whether you're talking about the Middle East or you're talking about what's going on in Ukraine. And I am able to talk a little bit about that. So to give you a little bit of a background on myself and my expertise to answer some of these questions for you, I served in the Marine Corps between 2016 and 2020. I served as a corporal in an 0352 anti-tank missileman in 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. I went to the Middle East twice. I did 2 deployments there. My first deployment between October of 2017 and March of 2018, I served in the country of Syria for about 4.5 months and about a month and a half in Kuwait while in transit. I did convoy escorts and supported special operations forces against the fight against the Islamic State. I was also part of the QRF team that went and responded to the Battle of Kasham down in the Conoco gas plants during February of 2018 when the Wagner Group ended up attacking a group of American forces at an outpost that we had there. So have a little bit of experience regarding that and Russian forces. I also went back to the Middle East during my second deployment between October of 2019 and March of 2020. I served as the Javelin team leader for Easy Company 27, who was acting as the crisis response company as part of the ground combat element of the Special Purpose MAGTF. As a result, I ended up going to the Baghdad Embassy complex as one of the 100 Marines that responded to the Baghdad Embassy crisis on New Year's of 2020. I was there for the assassination of General Qassam al-Soleimani, and I was also in charge of all anti-armor operations at the Baghdad Embassy complex. I went to Saudi Arabia after that, where I trained Saudi Arabian Marines preparing to go to Yemen to deploy as part of the Saudi coalition down there. And then I was rotated home. Now I work in logistics, where I am a dispatcher and a load planner or a logistical coordinator. So if I am a subject matter expert in anti-armor warfare and armored doctrine, I'm also a fully cross-trained machine gunner, a fully cross-trained rifleman. I am a partially cross-trained radio operator, and I'm a combat lifesaver certified Marine. I am very well versed in small unit leadership tactics as well as basic ground combat level elements. And when it comes to strategic stuff, I was never formally trained, but I at least have a little bit of intuition to give a general idea what's going on at that level. But please, with anything, take it as a grain of salt. And likewise, if you have questions outside of that spectrum, I try to remain well-rounded. I am very interested in geopolitics, history, and human geography, and many, many other things. Please feel free to ask, but if I do not know the answer to that question, I will simply say as such. Very open about that here. And I always implore you, regardless if I'm a subject matter expert or not, to please go through and please do your own research. There is no substitute as a viewer for doing your own research on any of these topics. If you have some interest in them, or you want to read more, or you want to learn more about them, please feel free to go and do your own research. Please do not believe everything that is said on the internet. So thank you very much for being here, and we'll get ready to jump right into the news here. Of course, starting with our special report here in Ukraine. And before I get really too into the news here, we of course get our update from Nuclear. Thank you for the Army Commander Conscriptovich. I know he was a little quiet on Saturday, given all the situations happening there at the front. He says, quote, "There is no Ukrainian shelling on the east bank of the Dnieper River. There is no panic." End quote. That's coming from Army Commander Conscriptovich, who initially started as a private Conscriptovich and has received numerous battlefield commissions after his entire chain of command has been killed before him. And we jump into the news here as we get serious, and we jump into Kyiv, where we, of course, get our update. So today is, of course, a very memorable day for Ukraine, not just because of the ongoing war, but because today marks 9 years. 9 years from the Maidan Revolution. Today is November 21st, the day of Ukraine's dignity and freedom. Or the democratic revolutions of 2004 and 2014. And there's, of course, several ceremonies. Many people were actually killed during that time. And several different videos have come out today regarding this. So this is coming from Alexander Sherba, who was 26 years in diplomatic services and was ambassador to Austria between 2014 and 2021.
Ми не боїмося смерті заради свободи. І свобода буде за нами, і свобода буде наша. І ми переможемо, і Україна буде в Європі. І вона буде серед всіх вільних народів світу. І вона не буде рабами, а ми будемо вільними.
Very passionate. This is coming from 2014 during the Maidan Revolution. And those exact same words are what we hear every single day when it comes to the officials here. We will never be slaves. We will always be free. We want to be part of Europe. These very same things that they were fighting for in 2014 that you still see them continuing to fight for now. Some of the photos coming from when the Maidan Revolution was ongoing. This is coming from the Verkhovna Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament. And they say, quote, happy Dignity and Freedom Day. For the Ukrainian people, dignity and freedom are not just words, but values for which the best people of the country, the heroes of the Heavenly Hundred, our defenders, paid and continue to pay the highest price. Over 100 people were actually killed during the Maidan revolutions, and we'll get to that here very shortly. Also coming from Army Informer, who has released this, for Maidan. Coming from the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, price of our freedom is high, but let's remember about this. And this video was released, and I think it's important to remember this. So this is coming from Visegrad 24, and they report on current affairs, history, and culture from Central and Eastern Europe. And this is footage. It's 1 minute and 33 seconds, but it's very important to remember, because most people don't remember what happened, and where all of this began. And it's very important to remember, this isn't, the invasion of Ukraine is not, it's not broken up into chunks. History is not broken up into neat blocks. It is, all history is current. It is one of the best ways I've ever heard that put. And that's from the Empolocene Review, if I remember that correctly. But anyway, what this is from Maidan Square here in 2014, back in February of 2014, during the protests. And this is when security forces under the Russian-backed government began opening fire on the protesters in Maidan Square using live ammunition. So it's 1 minute and 33 seconds of that footage. I think it's very important to remember that this is not a single event, and that Ukraine has never been about committing huge acts of violence against people, but they have been brutally suppressed for essentially their entire lives, for the entire existence. They have been brutally suppressed, or attempted to be brutally suppressed, in a series of wars and conquering, and then of course internal suppression from whatever government has occupied this land in their country, whether that be whether that be Imperial Russia, whether that be the Soviet Union, whether that be Nazi Germany, whether that be Russia, whether that be Russian puppet states in the fall of the Soviet Union. They have been brutally suppressed, continue to be brutally suppressed, and now we see the results now. But this is, once again, Maidan Square, the Russian-backed government using live ammunition against protesters in February of 2014. And that is from the Maidan Revolution. So very, very difficult time for Ukraine. Definitely a very difficult time in Ukraine, but a very important one, because it leads to the Ukraine that we see now. Ukraine very quickly, because of the Maidan Revolution, ends up shifting from being very pro-Russian, immediately shifting to, of course, the will of the people, which is immediately to wanting to be part of the EU, wanting to be part of Europe, wanting to join NATO, and a lot of other things. But unfortunately, a lot of people gave their lives during that revolution, and it is something to remember, because without this incident and the revolutions that came before it, there would never be, there never would have been the opportunity for Ukrainians to freely express themselves within their own nation, to dictate their own lives, and the ability to fight for their own freedom. And that's really what we end up seeing here. So But that does continue. We get some very good photos from that time too. So, once again, today is a day of remembrance. And there was ceremonies there at the... There were ceremonies at the... Sorry, my cat is playing with her activity board right now. But there were... ceremonies being held at the places where they have memorials and everything regarding this. But very important, once again, to remember. But we move on, and we end up finding a war crimes update. The war crime update comes from the press service and the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, and they are stating, quote, since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, Russian troops have committed 44,662 war crimes, approximately, in quote, in parentheses, against Ukraine and its citizens. Now, that number does fluctuate up and down as those proceedings continue, and as certain things get ruled off the books. Okay, this, as further investigations clarify, okay, this was not a war crime. And some are getting added, of course, continually. We've seen that list fluctuate up and down as more information comes to light, and those investigations are either concluding or continuing in many cases. So, but right now we're sitting at approximately 44,662 separate incidents of war crimes. War crimes, generally speaking, always terrible, right? We can agree that war crimes are always terrible, but they do happen. Both sides have committed war crimes. Even the United Nations has confirmed that that is true. Mistreatment, mostly of prisoners, or the summary execution of prisoners on the part of the Ukrainians. But we see that exceptionally extrajudicial execution of Ukrainian prisoners. Even especially civilians, forced deportation of children, which is actually a crime of genocide. We see uses of incendiary weapons, which we will get into here later tonight when we get to Bakhmut, which is under additional protocol 3 of the additional protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons is war crime. Furthermore, it also when used against troops, as we have seen them in the trenches, it also violates international humanitarian law, rule number 85. We also see pretty much every other war crime, indiscriminate bombardment, which violates Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions adopted in 1977. We see it all here, and we continue to see it. While yes, it's important to understand that Ukraine has committed war crimes, and will likely that will happen continually until the end of the war. There is a difference between isolated incidents, which can be verified as war crimes. We also know that those individuals are also under investigation. The vast majority of those which have been identified are under investigation by Ukraine, have been pulled out of frontline duty, and are currently undergoing the process of possibly going to trial and all of that fun stuff. When it comes to the Russians really don't have any accountability on that section, and the vast quantity of those war crimes committed by the Russian Federation really overshadow anything Ukraine has done quite significantly. And while it is important to continue to remember that those incidents are happening, Russia is to the point where it could be so widespread to the point that it can be considered systematic, which under the 1993 Rome Statute, of which created the International Criminal Court, and therefore also created the definitions for the official legal definitions of crimes against humanity. The widespread systematic attacks directed at civilians specifically would be considered crimes against humanity, as well as the inhumane treatment of anyone that is hors de combat, which is anyone who is no longer a combatant, including the wounded, the sick, and also medical personnel, and those who have surrendered. So that is what we were kind of looking at, and that is when you're talking about 44,662 acts of war crimes, that is what you would consider something as a crimes against humanity. Is too large, is too widespread. And yeah, I've said this before, if you have ever served, if you may be a veteran yourself and you've served in a war zone, say Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, or any therein, this is a war that is totally different than anything that myself or anyone else has really ever witnessed, unless you've gone there and seen it in person. This war is just on a scale that is almost incomprehensible. It's the largest war in Europe since the end of World War II. Really, And that it's just insane to think about. So this is a war on a whole different scale, and we also see a whole different scale of war crimes. Really, for the Russian Federation, they have adhered to absolutely no treaty when it comes to the Geneva Conventions or international humanitarian law, which they are actually a party to under the conventions, which is tracked by the United Nations. We also get a child casualty update, an especially dismal statistic that we end up having to give over and over and over almost on a daily basis here on the channel. And this comes from the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine stating, quote, since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, 437 Ukrainian children have died. 839 children have been injured. Most victims among children are from the Donetsk region. And once again, it does make sense. Most of these casualties are from the Donetsk region. These are the ones that we are tracking. There are over 200 children which are currently missing, as well as thousands which have been forcefully deportated to Russia, which is actually an act of genocide under the 1949 Geneva Conventions and 1993 Rome Statute. Those are usually released in separate, with a separate statement. We haven't seen that for some time. But the vast majority of the victims are from the Donetsk region. The Donetsk region has seen the heaviest fighting over the last 9 years since the Russian-backed separatist movement occurred there in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And we also see that's where some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war is taking place. And keep in mind, these are the children which can be verified by the Ukrainian forces. This does not include children in places such as Mariupol, Volnovakha, or many of the other places that are currently under Russian occupation, or that have seen very, very intense fighting over the last few months and over the last few years. We have a little bit of uplifting news, though, trying to offset some of that and to kind of keep this a little bit balanced. Is we have a new official UNICEF ambassador. And that would be Patron, our favorite puppy here on the channel. So he has officially become a dog of goodwill and an ambassador for UNICEF. With agreements formally signed yesterday, Patron now sports a new patch, which is for UNICEF on his little Kevlar vest, and a new award is added to his rapidly growing collection. And we do have some of these photos coming from the Verkhovna Rada, which is, of course, his handler was there, as well as a representative from UNICEF in Ukraine. And, of course, Patron had to be there in person, too. Then you can see here, there's Patron in all of his beautiful might there. All about 6 pounds of him. And you can see he has all of his patches there. And, of course, the new UNICEF patch. And here's some just archival photos. You can see Patron in his glory there before he was really pulled off the line there as an EOD working dog. He is an EOD working dog. That is his job. His handler is also an EOD member, so which stands for Explosive Ordnance Disposal. This means that he is my understanding is that he is a Jack Russell Terrier, exceptionally good sense of smell. What he does is he goes out there as well as his handler, and they go out and they find unexploded ordnance, meaning unexploded bombs, mortars, rockets, and he can identify them through sense of smell. His handler is then able to identify that explosive munition and then deactivate that explosive munition or detonate it in place, to allow for it to be neutralized and become safe. And we'll get to a little bit more work of what the EOD has been up to, but that is Patron. He has found over 1,000 different pieces of ordnance by himself. I think we're working our way up to almost 1,500 now. And of course, that doesn't mean he does. And just because he works hard doesn't mean he can't play hard too. So, very awesome dog. I always love to see Patron. He is adorable and makes me want to have a Jack Russell Terrier. We also see, and to build on that a little bit before I move on, the reason why he became a UNICEF ambassador. So UNICEF is the United Nations International Child Fund, is what it is, and so it's the whole point of UNICEF is to assist children through humanitarian efforts, providing educational relief, that kind of thing. since Patron became so famous, Patron got really pulled off the line from doing EOD work, and now what he and his handler do extensively is they are going through and they're going to different schools, they're going to different events, they're creating different videos and stuff using Patron to teach children the dangers of unexploded ordnance, as this will be a problem that will last for decades in Ukraine. And he's a very iconic dog. The kids absolutely love him, and I love him, and well, I guess I have the heart of a child, so I don't count. But regardless, he goes and he teaches kids the dangers of unexploded ordnance, keeps them engaged, and it really allows for that information to seep in, so that way when they come across, inevitably when children end up coming across this unexploded ordnance, they can be much more safe. They understand the danger of it to an extent because they can remember what they saw with Patron, and then they can also go and notify the adults and the authorities and whatever else needs to happen. But it keeps children, generally speaking, safe on top of the many other measures that are being taken by the Ukrainians. And so he's become very iconic, hence why he has become a UNICEF ambassador, because the work he has done for teaching children the hazards and dangers of unexploded ordnance here in Ukraine, which will affect a great deal, many of them. We're seeing hearing aids are coming in for residents. This is part of the Elena Zelenska Foundation, which is the foundation created by the first wife of President Zelensky in Ukraine. The Elena Zelenska Foundation joined the Cabinet on Wheels project by Vichui NGO and purchased 500 hearing aids for residents in deoccupied territories of Kyiv and Chernihiv Oblasts. You actually get this from the Elena Zelenska Foundation. We're going through and actually providing these, and they're actually able to conduct these hearing tests and everything else. They maintain mobile stations for this and also mobile fittings. Something that I was unable to find good footage of, unfortunately, that wasn't copywritten, was that the chef for the World Central Kitchen, they have provided. He actually ended up being awarded the Legion of Merit by President Zelensky today, yesterday. That is Chef Jose Andres, who runs the World Central Kitchen, whose link is actually in the description below. They've actually provided hot meals. He's a world famous chef. They provided hot meals for over 180 million people in Ukraine so far. So, or 180 million different meals to people in Ukraine so far. Please go and check them out. They're amazing. They're actually one of the very first into Ukraine, and they actually ended up providing the aid. Basic humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and built the basically logistical structures that are now being utilized in the country by the United Nations, the Red Cross, and everyone else. The World Central Kitchen were basically the first major organization to go in. They've continued to stay there. They continue to work, and they really have paved the path on how it needs to be done to reach the most amount of people in the safest way possible, to pretty much for everyone else to follow, even the international aid organizations, which have been doing this a much, much longer time. But please go and check them out. I'm sorry it wasn't on the map, but please go and check them out. They're in the description below. One of the very first organizations we had, and absolutely amazing. Getting back to those demining efforts and talking about EOD as we kind of roll off of Patron a little bit and off of the other aid work going on. But we see that demining efforts are continuing. Keep in mind, there are places in Europe, such as the Ardennes Forest, where parts of it are so damaged and destroyed. There's so much unexploded ordnance in these areas from World War I. There's still no-go. In fact, every single year during the plowing season, the very opening part of the agricultural year for farmers in France, they have what's called the steel harvest, where as they are plowing and disking their fields, they actually drag up all of this old ordnance from World War I and World War II, and they end up piling it off on the side of the road as if they were rocks being tilled up in their field. And they end up, EOD actually goes around in France and collects all this stuff. This is a similar issue as to what Ukraine will have. Ukraine has seen a heavy amount of artillery usage by both sides, especially in seasons like when we had at the very beginning of the war up here in the north, where there was a massive amount of Raspetita mud, and now as that begins again here in the south, that thick, heavy mud, what that ends up doing is it actually ends up absorbing a lot of this ordnance, especially BM-21 grad systems with their 122 millimeter Katyushas. What ends up happening is these things usually detonate by a crush switch, meaning the very front end of this hits the very hard front end of the missile, hits a hard object, and it crushes the end, and that is what detonates the explosive. Instead, it hits this very soft raspatita mud and it buries itself in the ground, and it doesn't crush the front end because it's a super soft on the ground, and therefore it doesn't detonate. And that's not the only thing. We see bombs doing this. We see artillery shells doing this, of course. We also see tons of mine usage on both sides, as neither party, neither Ukraine nor Russia, are party to the Ottawa Convention limiting and restricting the usage of self-triggering landmines. So we see that quite extensively by both sides throughout the entirety of the war. We also see quite a other things, of course, basic munitions as well. But as a result, the entire country of Ukraine is littered with unexploded ordnance, whether purposely left there or whether it was an accident and this stuff did not end up going off. What ends up happening is now this entire country is littered with unexploded ordnance, and there's not a whole lot of people that work in explosive ordnance disposal, or EOD, or are engineers, like combat engineers, who would deal with this kind of stuff. So it's a very high demand and very highly dangerous job. Very technical job. These guys are extremely smart, and it's also, there's not a whole lot of them, so very low supply, high demand situation. And when I say high demand, get a load of this. So this is coming from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which runs all of these operations. From their official Twitter, they stated that while they are happening slowly, just over the past 24 hours, 493 explosive objects were identified and removed or neutralized. And since the beginning of the war, they have neutralized 286,672 explosive objects, as well as 2,845 kilograms worth of explosives was removed by EOD personnel since the beginning of the invasion on February the 24th. Once again, very high demand job. And that's not it. That's not the only thing. They were called 94 times in the last 24 hours. They removed 493 explosive objects, and that was only on 44 hectares of land which they surveyed. It's not very much. It's very, very little, actually. So, I mean, that's not even close to a quarter of a square kilometer. We got a couple of questions coming in. Speaking of Wagner, did you see the meme I made for you, Paul? I did not see the meme. I apologize. Barbara Christina asks, Paul, I feel concerned about the blank nuclear missile found, I think, in Kyiv a day or so ago. Do you think this could be Putin's way of preparing for a nuclear accident? I do not. Putin would... So it's a big question just how much of the nuclear arsenal Russia can actually maintain. For those that don't know, nuclear weapons are extremely expensive to maintain. And as we can see from the General Army, their maintenance is not exactly very good. Or really anything for them is not exceptionally good. So there's a lot of questions as to how well maintained their nuclear arsenal is. We do know certain parts of the triad that they maintain do, in fact, work. We've seen them test some of it and operate some of it during training exercises. We do know that some of it works. And that is a legitimate threat, and we should take all nuclear kinds of threats seriously, whether that be tactical, strategic, nuclear accident, or you're talking about a dirty bomb, or what have you. But what Robert Christina is talking about is that there was basically a small intercontinental ballistic missile that was launched, and it ended up detonating inside of Ukraine. I don't know if it was Kyiv or somewhere else, but it did not have a nuclear warhead in it. Instead, it had the dummy that they would use for training inside of it. Now, this, I think, is less of a question as to whether or not this is the fact that they are planning on using a nuclear weapon, as more of a question of, does this mean that they are running out of their standard long-range ballistic missiles? And that really seems to be where that is headed, is more that they are running out of their standard purpose-built strategic or tactical long-range munitions, such as the Iskander M, or where you can talk about the Caliber cruise missile, or the I believe it's called the X-101 missile that's fired via the air. It's carried by an aircraft. It seems that they seem to be running more or less out of that, and their stockpiles are significantly depleted. And that's why you see them transitioning into things like intercontinental ballistic missiles that would, or ICBMs or TBMs, theater ballistic missiles, which are using dummy warheads and not carrying a nuclear package, but they are nuclear capable. And it wouldn't be the first time we see that. It just happens to be, it was one that was heavily reported. The S-300 batteries have the capability of using nuclear weaponry. They have the capability of launching a nuclear capable weaponry, but we haven't seen nuclear weapons being used throughout the duration of the war. We don't really see any kind of change in the nuclear posture of the Russian Federation, at least according to international security of organizations, whether you're talking about the United States, the United Kingdom, France, or really any of the other allied powers. And that's the official reports. So do take it with however you want to go with that. Of course, I wouldn't want to sow I wouldn't want to sow that kind of discord in my population. If there was a change, I wouldn't want to cause panic. But at the same time, I do believe that with what they're saying, it seems to be very reasonable. So I think it's more or less they don't have long-range munitions anymore. They're running out. They have to substitute with something else. That is what they have on hand until they can get and replenish a lot of their stockpiles of, say, the Shahed 131s and the Shahed 136 drones from Iran. Once those shipments come in, we'll probably see that pick back up, and we'll start seeing some of these dummy warheads being used less and less, because these things still have a lot of momentum and a lot of destructive power, whether or not they're carrying an actual nuclear payload or not. Another question comes from Delta Aviation 23, who asks questions. Some Ukrainian units have many different types of MRAPs. Could this make maintenance difficult? Yes, it could. So of course, all of these companies have to provide different parts, spare parts for these things. They have to fix these. They have to be fixable in the field. And when you're running multiple types of equipment, it makes it very, especially those ad hoc kind of groups that you see put together, it can become rather difficult. But we do see some minimization to that. We do see where certain units are utilizing very heavily the Humvee, or the high mobility multi-wheeled vehicle that's provided by AM General and is provided by the United States. Everyone knows what a Humvee is. Take a look at any photos from the invasion of Iraq, you'll find them there. Or any war in the last 30 years, you'll find a heavy usage of Humvees there. The SDF have Humvees, the Iraqis have, everyone has Humvees. Very capable vehicles, do not provide a lot of protection from landmines or IEDs, but overall generally capable vehicles. However, their armor packages do limit their capacity a little bit. MRAPs, really great for counterinsurgency, not really great for conventional war, because they provide a very high profile, but they do work really well because of the fact that, once again, Ukraine has a lot of unexploded ordnance and very heavy landmine usage, so it makes a little bit more sense for them, and it doesn't really make sense for the United States anymore for what they're really looking at, despite sinking billions of dollars into the program. And I actually was watching and reading a little bit about that earlier because I was kind of curious. But you see multiple different types of MRAPs being provided. You see the Navistar Max Pro. You see we're seeing some of Oshkosh's stuff rolling into there a little bit, just a little bit, not a heavy amount. But Oshkosh is a huge provider. It's the ones contracted for the U.S. military right now. They also make the JLTV, which is replacing the Humvee for the U.S. military. We also see the Turkish Kirpi, which is their version of the MRAP. You see them heavily utilized in Syria on the part of Turkish forces, and also in those parts of Turkish Kurdistan. We also see stuff coming from the United Kingdom. We see stuff coming from Australia. We see all sorts of equipment, and it can become very difficult to conduct maintenance, because all of these are very different. They have different manufacturers using different parts, different designs. And while some things are basic and remain quite more or less the same because of NATO standardization, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is interchangeable, because they are different manufacturers, they are different designs. So, but what we see Ukraine doing is some units, majority, especially motorized infantry units, are using the Humvees. We're seeing mechanized units using the MRAPs a lot more with their heavier vehicles, and you're really utilizing, and they'll usually take, like, this unit will get MRAPs, this unit will get Kirpis, this unit will get Max Pros, this unit will get Humvees, this unit will get Bearcats, this unit will get M113s. And it really, so that way that logistics, they can divert certain logistical part chains to this unit that requires, this unit, this unit, and this unit, which is these 3 units that they are operating the Max Pros. They get parts for the Max Pros. Well, this unit, and this unit, which are getting, these 3 units, which are getting, using the Kirby, will get parts for the Kirby. So we see that kind of being minimized in their supply chain. They're trying to standardize as best they can with what they get, but they also, beggars can't be choosers when it comes to what equipment they're getting, and they're going to utilize whatever the best stuff is that they can utilize on the front line that has any kind of tactical purpose. He follows that question up, of course, with can Max Pro be repaired if it hits a mine? Really depends on the extent of the damage. Some mines are much more dangerous than others. If it hits something like an anti-personnel mine, certainly, probably to a limited extent, it could be repaired depending on the damage that is done. But one of the key things for military vehicles, especially produced by the United States, like Max Pros, as well as the Humvees, is the ability to conduct relatively basic field work into their equipment. This is one of the things that draws a lot of controversy, but also makes a lot of sense if you actually put it into perspective. Give you an idea, look at World War II. Now, one of the biggest things that the United States was always hampered on is why they were fielding M4 Shermans when the Germans were, in Europe, when the Germans were fielding, some of the best tanks of the war, arguably. The Panther, the Tiger, the Tiger II. You're talking about the Panzer IVs, where, the United States is really undergunned with the M4 Sherman, unless you talk about until you talk about like the Sherman Firefly and the upgun Shermans. But why were they fielding something that really didn't have a whole lot of chance to it? Wasn't really adequately armored, and the reason being is because the U.S. tested these things so rigorously because they had to be repairable relatively in the field, meaning that pretty much you had to be able to take the whole engine out of it and swap a new engine into it in the field, in the middle of nowhere in Europe, because everything had to be shipped from the United States overseas to Europe. And it's not like you can ship the Sherman back that gets damaged back to the United States. It's not easy like that. So when you're talking about MRAPs and MAPVs and Humvees and stuff, that stuff has to be serviceable in the field, which really helps with the supply chain issues there. But it also is what one of the limiting factors is for it, as to what can be sent, because this stuff isn't going back to the United States for repairs. The Humvees are not going back to the AM General plant for repairs. These things are getting fixed in the field. So that's kind of what we're kind of looking at there. We move on and we come up here and into the Kharkiv Oblast, where we're seeing a couple of different developments coming out. 2 people were injured by shelling over here in Volchansk here in the Kharkiv Oblast. Both of them were hospitalized after shelling ended up hitting residential areas. We do get some photos coming out here from that, or a photo. And you can see, of course, this just completely destroys these homes. And we're talking about usually saturation bombardments, BM-21 Grad systems. The BM-21 Grad stands for Hail. It's the current chassis, which uses the 122 millimeter Katyusha rockets, which have been used really by the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation since the Battle of Stalingrad, which made them very famous. We continue to see those being used quite in some large numbers. BM-21 Grad system is one of the most popular, I should say, types of artillery systems being used by the Russian Federation and quite extensively by Ukraine too. And they use 40-round salvos to basically saturate an area with high explosive power. They're not discriminate. They're unguided rockets. They're not smart munitions. They're dumb munitions, and they just fill an entire area with explosive power. Hence why when they are used against civilian places, civilian cities and towns and villages, is considered indiscriminate fires, which violates Protocol 1, additional Protocol 1 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which was adopted in 1977. Indiscriminate fires are a war crime, and when used in a systematic way, therefore justify crimes against humanity under the International Criminal Court and under the 1993 Rome Statute. It's not the only place to receive shelling. According to Oleh Subinov, the head of the Kharkiv Regional Military Administration, quote, Russian occupiers shelled the settlement of Shevchenkove in the Kupiansky district in the Kharkiv region on November 20th. One woman was killed and 2 citizens were injured. Local residential buildings were damaged. The rescue operation is ongoing. And we have not received any further updates regarding that situation. Delta Aviation says, in speaking about MRAPs, Ukraine has captured some Russian MRAPs. Those don't have spare parts, so how do they fix them? I really haven't seen... So the Russian MRAP that you're talking about, it's called the Gaz Tiger. Replaces the Gaz light utility vehicle that came before it. Very popular in the Soviet Union from about the 1960s and onward. Basically, their version of the Jeep. And the Gaz Tiger is the MRAP version. It's less of an MRAP, more of a Humvee. Flat bottom hull, really doesn't, really the armor is on the sides and on the top, not really necessarily on the underside of the vehicle. It's basically their answer to the Humvee. A little bit heavier armor, I'd say a little bit of a better engine. It's purpose built, whereas the Humvees receive their armor upgrades afterwards and it weighs them down. Their engine really wasn't upgraded to meet the task. And so they do have spare parts. It's limited in quantity. They do have limited amounts of spare parts for late Soviets and of course, early Russian Federation stuff. They had Gaz Tigers in their inventory beforehand. Not an extensive amount of them, but they do have them. But we also don't see them very heavily fielded. Even though they are quite common to be captured. But more often than not, when we find Gaz Tigers, they're more or less in a condition that makes them not repairable, or at least their parts can be cannibalized off of that to get at least one unit into a running, working condition. So, but most of the time, these Gaz Tigers are just too far destroyed. They really don't hold up very well against the types of fires that they are being engaged with. And overall, they do not last very long in an outset of an engagement. They're usually some of the very first vehicles we see being destroyed at an engagement, should they come across a convoy of these things. And that really speaks volumes when you're talking about taking a look at some of the Russian forces using things like technicals, like the Chechen forces that are using technicals instead of Gaz Tigers. We know that the Russians built a large quantity of Gaz Tigers and therefore have lost a large quantity in this war, and they simply do not have the industrial capacity to replace them. This is coming out of the Luhansk Oblast. You can take your pick out of where, but this is coming from Serhiy Cherovati. Once again, I apologize for my pronunciation. Spokesman of the Eastern Group of the Armed Forces of Ukraine stated, quote, as of November the 20th, the Armed Forces of Ukraine have liberated 12 settlements in the Luhansk region. So we are seeing them moving slowly but surely in the Luhansk region, pushing up towards Zvatove up here in the north, where we see quite an amount of Russian troops being concentrated. We also see quite a defensive line that is reportedly being built there. Ukrainian forces still pushing their way there, but we do not have a lot of information coming from the front other than the fact that Makivka is essentially does no longer exist except for in name. So not a whole lot of information coming from the front lines, but we usually expect that as highly kinetic operations are ongoing, and we do expect some operational security delay on those. We move into the Donetsk Oblast, where we start off with our daily Donetsk update coming from Pavel Krylenko, the head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration. He stated, quote, on November the 20th, the number of victims of Russian army in Donetsk Oblast increased by 3 injured. So luckily, no one has been killed over the last 24 hours. This comes out at 8 a.m. local time every single morning in Ukraine. And this is covering the last 24 hours of activity. We do get this from Pavel Krylenko's official Twitter, which he keeps updated here. And once again, this came out at 8 a.m. as of this morning local time. And we can see Kostanivka, we have 1 injured, and Bakhmut has 2. Bakhmut continues to see very heavy shelling. And he goes on. This diagram gives us further information from the start of the open Russian Federation invasion, meaning since February the 24th. So far, 1,216 civilians have been killed and 2,616 have been injured within the Donetsk Oblast. That does not include areas under occupation, whether you're talking about Donetsk, whether you're talking about Mariupol or Volnovakha. Those are not counted, as there's no information that can be confirmed coming from those regions. And that allows us to kind of move into the actual front lines here within the Donetsk Oblast, where we have several different developments. The first one comes out of the north, Soledar and Bakhmutsky. This is kind of to the north of the city of Bakhmut. This is the same axis of advance. What we see is the Russian Federation, their troops, specifically the Wagner Group, which is the main ground combat element within this region, are constantly trying to find gaps in the line and trying to push their way either to encircle Bakhmut and then close in it, or they're trying to just and then they switch up their tactics and try to assault Bakhmut directly. We've seen assaults both to the north in Soledar and Bakhmutsky, where we actually see Russian troops in and around this area. In fact, we had some geolocated to this factory here. We know they're actually in and around the cities and towns, or they at least were, though we don't have too much updated information about troop changes. Likewise, we also heard that there was a significant amount of fighting down here near Optine and also near Klishchivka down here into the south. We heard that they were conducting an offensive to the south of Bakhmut that was reportedly repelled. We do not have a lot of extensive in detail information from the front, but we have enough to kind of piece together a general sense of what is happening. But because we don't have the information, you also will not see the lines on this map change until we can get some concrete information of some significant changes. Out of Soledar, that fighting does continue, and the fact is that both in Bakhmut, as we will get to, and here in Soledar, Bakhmutsky, we see that the conditions are very, very decrepit. You're talking about very brutal fighting. Victories are measured in meters instead of kilometers along this front. You're talking about an absolute war of attrition. Heavy bombardments by both sides has left this entire area decimated by artillery fire. It is very much a World War I battlefield. It has been essentially a World War I battlefield for some time. And what do we see now? We see that the winter is now set in. And now here in the Donbass, this is very fertile farmland, meaning that this is prime area for the Rasputitsa mud, which has reared its ugly head. It is exceptionally cold here in Ukraine, with temperatures dipping below zero in some areas. And we also see snowfalls already coming in. The conditions have gone from bad to worse. It is now a muddy, wet, cold, miserable mess in the middle of the ruins of a city with some of the most brutal fighting that we have seen since the Battle of Mariupol. And that is what the conditions are in Soledar and in Bakhmut.
О, вертушечки. Раз и два. Сейчас петушарам насыпят, по самой не балуя, 100%. О, нурси пішли, йопти, на армур. Вот это тема. Фу. Солидар, 20 листопада 2022 року.
Блін, головне на пояс на Дніпр скрізь.
Да, пояс на Дніпр. Вийдемо зараз на платформу. Пояс перевернутий. О, обратно полетіли. О, вертушечки.
Меня тоже замучал. Ты обещал купить кассету «Сердючки». Ха-ха-ха. Вот такая песня для котов. Пою, тут сижу. И жарю яичницу с колбаской. У меня тут вот на кухне вообще все идеально. Как у Бориса Бурды. Кс-кс-кс. Кошки, почему вы такие красивые? Скажи, хуй его знает, мы сами не знаем. Мяу.
At least he's still eating good. And in good spirits. Come down here to Bakhmut, where the heavy fighting is also still ongoing. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of direct combat footage we're getting out of these places. It's more about the general situation around them. So I apologize if you're expecting combat footage. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot. I don't think that that is the first thing these guys are thinking about, considering how brutal the fighting is here. Quite literally, we do have some footage. It is too gory to put here on the channel, and I do not believe it needs to be said. But when I say a World War I battlefield, I truly mean it. You're talking about two groups of heavily armed uniformed individuals who are in very static defensive trench lines with a muddy, bog-filled mess between them. The woodlands are splintered and destroyed. The city is in ruins. It is muddy, it is cold, it is wet, it is miserable. And the Russians are assaulting these Ukrainian positions in waves of troops, similar to crossing no man's land on the battlefields of the Somme and Verdun and in Passchendaele Ridge. So we literally see whole groups, entire platoons and squads of Russian troops completely cut down by machine gun fire, sometimes by 50 cals, but that's just not something to talk about or show here on the channel. It's just too gory and too horrific that I think a general viewing audience doesn't need to see. But the fighting is still ongoing in Bakhmut despite weeks of real deadlock with very minimal gains between Ukrainian and Russian forces. Once again, both sides have taken very substantial casualties here, and both not just in personnel, but material losses too. The city of Bakhmut is now lying in complete ruins as Russian artillery bombardments indiscriminately pepper the city, upwards of 3+ times a day. And what I mean peppering the city, once again, those BM-21 grad systems, multiple batteries firing on the city and just leveling. It is not being directed at Ukrainian forces. It is literally just to shell the city itself. And this is yet another, once again, another city in which victories are measured in meters, not kilometers.
До победы осталось совсем чуть-чуть.
Fortunately, it has copyright music on this one too. But you can see just the absolute destruction. I mean, these are residential areas. These do not have any military value to them whatsoever. These are just residential areas on the outskirts of Bakhmut. And not a single house is untouched by artillery fire. Not a single one. And it only gets worse the deeper and deeper into Bakhmut you go. That shelling, we've seen images and footage of children that are living in basements right now, as there is no way it is safe to go above ground at this point. So heavy fighting, there is no humanitarian aid coming into these places. Bakhmut receives humanitarian aid only through the kindness of the troops that are there and police officers, which risk their lives going in there to evacuate the elderly and drop off whatever supplies they can. We see Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut literally pulling food that is meant for them to take to the line. They're literally pulling food out of their bags and handing it to Ukrainian civilians on the side of the road as they are coming past them. It is exceptionally difficult, and the other organizations deem it too dangerous to go into Bakhmut to provide any kind of humanitarian aid. Reportedly coming from the Bakhmut area as well. This is reportedly a Russian convoy which received artillery fire and was destroyed. There's that Gaz Tiger that we were just talking about. As you can see, just a massive amounts of destruction. And once again, both heavy casualties material-wise and personnel-wise on both sides.
Там дерева, блядь, позбивали. Там погано видно. Тут все впало дерево, блядь. Блядь, застряло. З цієї сторони не вилетіло, а дерево потріскалось. Така хуйня.
See some of the conditions in one of these little small dugouts. And you can see that Rasputitsa mud, that water that's filling these trenches. Unfortunately, warfare really hasn't changed in that regard over the past 100 years. You can see some of the artillery batteries that are currently operating outside Bakhmut, posted in these amazing photos. Once again, these artillery batteries are playing a huge role for both sides of this war. Something coming in that has come in recently tonight, one of the final things to come in, is the usage of incendiary munitions in and around the city of Bakhmut. The usage of incendiary weapons is especially horrendous, and incendiary weapons are probably one of the most humane ways, or inhumane ways, you can kill somebody. They are extremely slow, they're extremely painful. The incendiary munitions burn at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. They ignite anything they come in contact to on fire, and they do not stop burning until it burns itself out. They are extremely dangerous. They're extremely volatile. By using them against a highly concentrated civilian population, whether that be a town, village, or city, or any group of civilians in general, that it constitutes a war crime under the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, Additional Protocol 3, which is the usage of which prohibits the usage of incendiary weaponry anywhere in, around, or near concentrated civilian populations. And it does constitute a war crime. Also constitutes a war crime under international. It also breaks, I should say, international customary humanitarian law rule number 85, prohibiting the usage of incendiary munitions against personnel unless no other weaponry is capable of being used to render them hors de combat or no longer a combatant. And that is coming from the International Committee of the Red Cross's database, and that is meaning that their usage against Ukrainian personnel is also a war crime. So either way, this is a war crime. And now we get to watch it as it unfolds. What these are 9S22Ms, which are a type of BM-21 Grad system rocket. These are 122 millimeter Katyusha rockets that use incendiary pellets. They airburst over their target in order to create a widespread area of effect, and it drops all around there, and it creates the largest area of effect that they possibly can by airbursting over their target and then raining down onto them. The 9S22Ms do not use, from my knowledge, they use a different type of incendiary munition that's not ever been explicitly explained by any of the sources I have found. But my understanding is that is neither considered thermite nor is it considered white phosphorus, which are used for different purposes altogether. But regardless, these are incendiary munitions. These are being used. This one here is being used against Ukrainian positions, which constitutes a war crime under the rule number 85 of international humanitarian law. And you can see there, so it produces the thick white smoke, which can be used, that's what white phosphorus is used for. White phosphorus is used in order to provide a smoke screen. Its fumes are toxic, which is why you don't push through them as a smoke screen. But white phosphorus is used by conventional armies in order to provide a very large smoke screen, a very thick white smoke that can allow for the obscuring of movement. It's used by artillery and mortars. And what these are purpose built for are destruction. These are purposely built to kill and destroy enemy troops or destroy whatever targets that are intended. They are not intended. So basically, their manufacture alone is essentially a war crime. The intention of their usage is a war crime in and of itself. This is not the first time we've seen the usage of these. We also can see it in Syria as well. But you can see over here where it hits the ground and it ignites everything else on fire and picks up after that. And you can kind of see where some of this burns out. These are pellets that fire out of the 9S22M. These are like little pellets filled with incendiary munitions. So sometimes they won't burn for very long, but if they ignite something else on fire, they will continue to burn, and it will cause an ecological disaster, even if not otherwise. And it's also a war crime to use them against heavy forests and vegetation unless they're being used for military purposes. So yeah, and that's also under Additional Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why the usage of incendiary weapons is extremely terrible. Vietnam really put an end to that with napalm and super napalm. But we see, you can very clearly see what's happening there. We continue here with Bakhmut itself. And this is what I mean by its usage against highly concentrated civilian populations. This is those munitions. This is up close and personal. Riley did put a very important tip in here. Also, hopefully no one will be near them, but should you be near them or be around them, do not throw water on it. It will cause a reaction that actually usually leads to a detonation, meaning it explodes. It's a very combustible materials. Just leave it alone. If you have to do something with it, bury it. But if you move it, it can actually reignite the reaction and create that reaction to fizzle back up. Kind of like stoking a fire. So if you have to do something to it, bury it. But if nothing else, just don't do anything to it and leave it alone. And let EOD know, or whoever the authorities on your area know, so that way they can handle it. My understanding, there are certain chemicals that you can use, but it's usually those are going to be restricted in access, and really only the fire department and EOD personnel are probably going to have them. But this is incendiary munitions raining down on a town and a bunch of people. Take a look. Once again, huge war crime. And this isn't the first time. In fact, this is the 5th time in a row on Bakhmut alone, just Bakhmut, that we here at the New News have reported on incendiary weapons usage on Bakhmut. This is the 5th instance. I have been keeping track. This is the 5th instance I have reported on Bakhmut alone being shelled with incendiary weapons. Once again, that proves it to be systematic, which under the 1993 Rome Statute and the definition of crimes against humanity, this is considered crimes against humanity. Down here in the, oh man, I'm going to try and pronounce this, the Kubashivsky district of the city of Donetsk, which is under Russian control. A large fire was noticed, very large fire indeed. However, while it is suspected that it was a Ukrainian precision-guided artillery strike against another depot located in the city or a command center, we simply do not know the cause or the origin or the true nature of the fire. We just understand that it has happened. A couple of videos coming out here from typical Donetsk. And so we continue on down the line. Come over here where we can see, I talked quite extensively today about Rasputitsa mud. And I brought it up quite a few times, and for those that may not remember, those are the really, really muddy conditions. Those all at the very beginning of the war. Really bogged down the Russian army terribly. Now, Rasputitsa mud is very famous. It's very famous for bogging down armies during the Second World War, during the First World War, during Napoleon's invasion into Russia. It bogged down the Soviets, it bogged down the Germans, it bogs down everybody. And it bogged down the Russians, of course. Now, both sides suffer via this. This is an environmental factor that both sides will have difficulty overcoming in many ways. This very thick mud, many roads, especially in this part of Ukraine, down here in the southern and the eastern parts of Ukraine, these are dirt roads. These are roads which are going to be affected by that very thick Rasputitsa mud. Literally an ocean of mud, or a sea of mud, is what Rasputitsa stands for. And it makes that even many roads are impassable. If they are not just sinking your vehicle, they are absolutely slick, and they are causing you to drift and go into a ditch where then you will sink. Not only are the roads difficult in many ways to pass unless they are paved, but the fields are almost impossible to pass over on foot, let alone in a vehicle where these armored vehicles, these heavy vehicles, MRAPs in some cases alone weigh over 60,000 pounds with their armor packages, let alone 70-ton tanks. And so we're seeing that these things are sinking quite easily, or they're just slipping all over the road. This means that it restricts both sides. Both Ukraine and Russia will be restricted to using well-improved road systems, which bottlenecks them and does not really allow for quite an extensive amount of maneuver warfare, meaning it will be very difficult for them to conduct any kind of major offensives without being easily bogged down under enemy fire and having predictable movements of troops that can be exploited by the other side. But we can see some of the instances here. This is a Navistar Max Pro trying to drive through some of this Rasputitsa mud on a rather unimproved trail here on the side of a field. You see some of the difficulty it's having. Once again, the Navistar Max Pro weighs in excess of over 60,000 pounds. It's extremely difficult for these things to move. It's very difficult for these things to maneuver, even sometimes in the best of conditions. These things are also very top-heavy. So it also gives them a huge disadvantage. They have a possibility of tipping over. You see, he's not able to get real good traction. He's slipping and sliding. He's digging into that mud. It's very easy to become stuck. It's very difficult to maneuver that vehicle very well. And you see he's getting stuck in the mud there. And despite all that weight, these things, that weight actually can work against it, especially in these conditions where it's so slick, because it's already very difficult to get these things moving. When you get into an MRAP and you get into the driver's seat and you go to drive one of these things, a 7-ton, an MRAP, a Humvee, you feel it when you try and give it to gas, and you feel it when it finally starts to lurch forward and actually starts to get moving. These things take an immense amount of power to actually just get that nudge to go, and that's in the best of conditions. Totally dry, totally great pavement, asphalt, let alone in these kinds of vehicle conditions. Likewise, that's not the only one. We can see a little deja vu going on here. For those that get the reference, this is another MRAP provided to them. Dare I say, French denominated VAB, and this thing is just slipping and sliding everywhere. Once again, this is an unimproved road, meaning it does not have pavement. It is a dirt road, and as a result, this Rasputitsa mud is already very heavily affecting armored vehicle traffic on it. Take a look. You see he's fishtailing there. He's trying not to go in the ditch. He's trying not to run off the road. And that is everywhere along the front line now. And it's only going to get worse as the winter progresses. Now, there will be a period in about the middle of winter, at the coldest point in winter, where that permafrost is going to set in. And that gives a very short window of about a month to anywhere from a month, month and a half, 2 months, where Ukraine can once again maneuver on relatively stable soil. That mud will be gone, the permafrost will have set in, those cold conditions will have hardened the ground. And then by that time, we get to late February, early March again, in which case the Razzmatazza rears its ugly head, and we are back to the same condition until we look at April, May, and that's kind of how the rest of this war is probably about to play out environmentally. Now, we've already seen how the winter is already starting to really set in those sub-zero temperatures, so hopefully that ground will harden relatively quickly, but it all depends on Mother Nature, and that is something that no one on the battlefield has control over. Delta Aviation says they could use tire chains, not for a 60,000 pound MRAP. Not that easy. It's not that easy, unfortunately. We come over here, where this is down in Mariupol, where we hear that, according to Petro Andrushenko, who's the advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, that we're seeing quite an extensive amount of heavy Russian equipment movement through the city of Mariupol, apparently on its way to Rozovka, Zaporizhia. Now, so if we can go over here, figure out where that's at, that'll give us a better understanding as to what's going on here. Well, allow me to just copy and paste this. Rozivka. That puts it up here. Ish. Is about where they're talking about. So we're talking about up in here. So this will probably carry on. This is an improved road system, so this will probably carry on up here towards Huliopol. We also have seen significant upticks in fighting near Volodar. So we can expect probably to see some of that pick up too. But regardless, down here in Mariupol, we do see heavy amounts of equipment on the move. Unfortunately, not some great photos. These look like they are BMDs. BMDs are basically... so there is no light infantry in the Russians. In the Russian military doctrine, there is no light infantry. Unlike the United States, right? Like, I served in an infantry battalion. Means there were a lot of guys that were hiking. We had to get transportation somewhere. Or if you were lucky like me, I got to call them crunchies because I was in a mounted unit, because I was in a combined anti-armor team, meaning I rolled around in Humvees and MRAPs. But most of the time, those guys they're hiking, they're walking. Then you have your mechanized unit, your cavalry scouts, your light armored reconnaissance, or LAR, or you have your cavalry scouts for the U.S. Army, run around the Bradleys. That kind of methodology is for everything in the Russian Federation. Not very heavily infantry focused, but instead focused on the mechanized portion of it, the armored vehicles. They built a lot of armored vehicles, not particularly great ones, but they're what they lack in quality, they make up for in quantity. At least that was the thought process. We've seen how well that worked out in reality. These appear to be BMDs. BMDs are, so you have the BMPs, which are these large armored fighting vehicles. And then you have their smaller cousins called the BMD series. The BMD series, the whole point of it is they have the ability to collapse their tracks. They can collapse their suspension to fit on board aircraft. It means that the BMDs were designed to be able to be brought in with paratroopers, also known as the VDV. That was their whole point. They're lighter. They can't carry as much armament or munitions or troop carrying capacity like the BMPs can, but they're meant for paratroopers. They can actually be paradropped, hypothetically, but at least they can be loaded onto aircraft after an air assault force seizes an airfield and allows for aircraft to land, to at least give them some kind of armored support while they wait for the main ground forces. We've seen them having to be supplemented instead, however. We can see some of the BMP. These are BMPs that are being brought in here. Now, the BMDs are going to have a smaller track width. You see BMPs being brought in here, and you can see them running away there. But we are seeing heavy equipment movements regardless. But just a little bit of a snippet, you'll be seeing, those actually might have been BMPs instead of BMDs. Very difficult to tell with grainy footage, but but you can see the difference. They're much smaller, but they're still pretty cool. They're cool little tankettes essentially, but they aren't necessarily all that good in practice. We come over here over to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which has once again been shelled, and this comes to the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, where they reported heavy shelling in and around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. They state that while there was damage to the site overall, none of the critical infrastructure was struck, and there was no loss of power or radiation leaks at this point. Coming once again from the official Twitter of the International Atomic Energy Administration, reporting last night and today they were getting shelled. Dozens of blasts from apparent shelling in some sites, buildings and systems and equipment were damaged, but none so far critical for nuclear safety and security. Likewise, they released an update this morning. Shelling at the site has stopped. There's been damage to parts of the site, but no radiation leak or loss of power. They will be conducting an assessment tomorrow. Brings us over here into the Kherson Oblast and into the Mykolaiv Oblast as well a little bit, where we see that humanitarian aid is getting to Kherson. Medical kits to treat 100,000 for 3 months. Water for 10,000. Blankets and sleeping bags for 500 families, and 230 solar lamps have so far been sent to Kherson, coming from the OCHA, or the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs for the United Nations. We are seeing that stuff getting pulled there into the region and into Kherson for these people who literally have nothing. We don't leave ours behind. So the Russians... Okay, so this is an article that was written by The Guardian. I've seen it posted in several other places, according to official Ukrainian sources. They state that Russians used a local garbage dump here in the Kherson Oblast to use to dispose of the dead Russian troops. Locals believe the dump was used to burn dead soldiers and buried them on the ground. No evidence yet other than a lot of helmets and uniforms that they have been finding there. If you want some more information for some more context, please feel free to check out theguardian.com. Once again, you can get our map. The link's in the description below. You can go to our website and pull the maps from there, and you can click on this link as well. Up here, we're going to jump into the Mykolaiv Oblast. Go ahead and hit this while we're here. The Ministry of Internal Affairs and then officially announced that the police station in the village of Snugorivka in the Mykolaiv Oblast has officially reopened. This will provide local security resources for the area, as well as allowing for investigators to complete a little bit more in-depth investigations into Russian war crimes throughout that region. Once again, we get this from the official Twitter of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine. We have several different points coming from the city of Kherson itself. And the first one is that 4 torture chambers have already been discovered within the city of Kherson. We do know that this was coming, and investigations will take some time, as quite a significant amount of territory was captured very rapidly. And that means that there will be a lot of investigation that will still have to be ongoing. But, quote, as of November 21st, Ukrainian law enforcement officers have found 4 torture chambers in the liberated city of Kherson. Russian occupiers illegally held and tortured here Ukrainian citizens, coming from the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine. And even the history and culture of this region was not safe. While Russian troops were in the city and retreating, they ended up breaking into and looting the Kherson Museum of Local Lore, stealing every artifact maintained in the facility, both from storage and from its exhibits. These photos posted by the Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada posted, which is the Ukrainian parliament. But you can see a former decommissioned artillery shell, blank holsters there. Seeing cannonballs. Look, I mean, it's just emptied. Even ancient artifacts from the time where parts of this region were a Greek colony. Unfortunately, the city has started to experience what we all expected and what we all believed was only going to take a matter of time. And that is the fact that the city has been shelled with cluster munitions at this point. Not just any types of cluster munitions, but it is believed that these are in fact not sabot rounds, but flechette rounds. Meaning that they fire thousands of little darts into people. It's anti-personnel instead of explosive. That is what I'm talking about. That is a flechette dart. So thousands of these, think of them as a nail. It's essentially just a nail with a little dart tip on the end instead of a flat head. And these things, there's thousands of them, and they're all just packed into this giant cone. And then when this thing, it airbursts over the target, and it just shoots thousands of these little darts everywhere. And they get all, and it's horrific. It is absolutely horrific. There are certain things that you still use flechette rounds for. You don't use them for long-range artillery. You usually use flechette rounds if an artillery battery was under attack and they had enemy infantry that were closing in with them. What they would do is they would actually take the howitzer and they would level the gun and they would load flechette round into it. And they basically fire it point blank as a giant shotgun into the face of the enemy. Similarly, tanks carry flechette rounds too. There's also, I believe, a flechette round for the M3 Carl Gustav, but those are used in only certain circumstances. They're not meant for long-range artillery bombardment of a city. It's meant for the enemy is in your face and you would like a giant shotgun, not there's a city full of thousands of people that are still out and celebrating right now. Let's go hit it with a bunch of flechette rounds, which are extremely difficult. I can't imagine how difficult it is I've never had to deal with a flechette casualty. One of the few things I've never had to deal with, but I've dealt with shrapnel wounds and they are extremely difficult in of themselves. I cannot imagine how difficult it is to deal with, flechette as a doctor or a surgeon or a corpsman or anyone else. That has got to be one of the worst things to have to deal with. Long queues are going on in Kherson for drinking water. This is something we continue to see in areas recently liberated. Unfortunately, Kherson, like just about everywhere else in Ukraine right now that's along the front lines, has suffered extensively and has essentially had all basic supplies, all basic infrastructure either destroyed or turned off. And as a result, it means that they don't have many things, if anything. Running water is non-existent in the city, really. They are getting it trucked in right now, clean, potable drinking water. There is no gas in the city. They cannot warm their homes. There's no electricity. They cannot charge their phones. And that's one of the things that a lot of generators are going to right now, is to bring them into Kherson so people can communicate who haven't been able to communicate for such a long time. So it's an extremely difficult situation despite being liberated. It is very difficult, especially as it is getting very cold. And we see that people are getting in line just to get as much help as possible and to get just drinking water. This line, the queue line for drinking water, was longer than 1 kilometer in its entirety. Reported by Save the Children in Ukraine. The oblast is left with little to no heating, water, or medical supplies. Vital infrastructure is either destroyed or littered with explosives, and more than 164,000 people are in immediate need of assistance. Save the Children in Ukraine here.
Today from Kherson, the entire city without power, food and water, and particularly heating as we're approaching winter. So Save the Children are here on the ground today to distribute life-saving assistance, including distributing water to households, as well as registering people for immediate cash assistance.
one of a plethora of different organizations there on the ground providing humanitarian aid. We move over into the Odessa Oblast, where we get, of course, an update on the grain initiative. Eight ships loaded with 342,000 tons of agricultural products have left Ukrainian ports over the weekend. Another 4 ships with 130,500 tons, 130.5 thousand tons of foodstuffs on its board are moving along the grain corridor. From August 1st, 483 ships exported 11.6 million tons of Ukrainian foodstuffs, and that's coming from the Ukrainian Ministry of Infrastructure. You can see some of these ships are there in port there, and the Oblast, coming from the official Twitter of the Ministry of Infrastructure of Ukraine. But that is actually everything inside the country of Ukraine for the night. But that doesn't mean the news ends there, as there is a lot of big developments elsewhere throughout the world. And we start off our international news as close to Ukraine as possible as we come up here into Moscow. We see that they've come to take me away. Much like being whisked away to the funny farm, refusal to fight in Ukraine for conscripts means a swift transport to prison. We can see a young conscript who refuses to go to Ukraine during a company formation, and they are swiftly whisked away and made an example of in front of the rest of the unit.
Верно, Лёва Селиванов. Ко мне.
Старший следователь, военно-следственный отдел по вооружению гарнизону, майор 38. Наш документ. Дата рождения 20-го. Значит, в отношении вас 16 ноября в 11 часов возбуждено уголовное дело по части 2 прим. 1 статьи 332 Уголовного кодекса Российской Федерации. Значит, сейчас время у нас 14:17 минут, вы задержаны. Мы доставить задержанного на состояние.
Конвой, произвести задержание. Давай, Дегтярев. Выйти из строя.
Старший следователь, военно-следственный отдел по следственной организации Российской Федерации по вооружению гарнизону, майор 38.
Погромче.
Ваши документы. Дата рождения.
04/04.
Юрий Николаевич, объявляю вам, что в соответствии с постановлением возбуждения уголовного дела в отношении вашего 16 ноября 2022 года в 10 часов возбуждено уголовное дело по части 2 прим. 1 статьи 332 Уголовного кодекса Российской Федерации. Значит, объявляю время 13:20, вы задержаны. Майор, доставить задержанного на место составления протокола.
Chaos, a smart choice he did there. Probably one of the smartest in his life. That was probably it. Yeah, that's probably the smartest choice he made, because he's going to prison. Which Russian prison, not fantastic. That's for very sure. May die in prison, but he probably has a lot higher survival rate in prison in Russia than he does going to the front lines. If you may remember, the 3rd Russian army group went into Ukraine, and within 72 hours of arriving in country, they had suffered 83% casualty rates and were rendered completely combat ineffective and essentially destroyed in all but name. Yeah. Now they weren't a full strength army group. I want to mention that. Those were in between Russia having manpower issues and Russia forcing conscription. Those were the volunteer battalions. and they completely were destroyed. So definitely not going very well right now, but he probably made a very wise decision. But they were basically monitoring his phone. He had messages on his phone. I don't want to go to Ukraine, this, that, and the other. Looked down his phone, held his phone. You know, is this your phone? Is this your messages? All right, take them away, boys. And calling him right out there in the middle of the formation, making an example of him. Sound familiar? Russia, does this sound familiar to you? Russia is planning on creating a Russian cultural front. That is why a roundtable will be held in Duma on the November 21st to announce the creation of the Russian Cultural Front. Jesus. Just picture Adolf Hitler's rise to power and go.
Поэтому 21 ноября в Думе пройдет круглый стол, где будет объявлено о создании культурного фронта России. Принимаем кодекс чести деятелей культуры и объявляем об организации культурного фронта России, причем он будет собран не только из великих наших мастеров, из председателей всех творческих союзов, из таких имен, как Гергиев, Башмет, Михалков. Придет туда молодежь, консерваторцы из ВГИКа, ГИТИСа и так далее. И вот мы все объединяемся в одной общей идее служения Господу и России. Поэтому...
Not just that, it also sounds like the creation of the Soviet Union all over again. Crazy how that went. Absolutely blows my mind how that went. But that's what we end up seeing here. This is going from Anton Jeroshenko. Move over here and into Germany, where we see almost instant karma. So there's this girl on social media. She was going around and she was harassing Ukrainians. She literally a couple months ago became famous. She's a Russian social media influencer. She was harassing Ukrainian refugees in Germany. And she's being deported to she's being deported from Germany right now. She's being deported for illegal residence and prostitution without a permit. So, not quite instant karma, but close enough.
Protein for light, yeah? Protein for light?
Где Херсон? Да, Украина. Уже референдум проводят.
Well, don't be a hateful bitch. You won't get deported. I don't know. Don't be a bad human being, and bad things will happen to you. That's generally how it goes. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly is calling members to recognize Russia as a terrorist state. NATO Parliamentary Assembly called on governments and parliaments of member countries of the alliance to recognize the Russia as a terrorist regime. European Parliament will vote this week to recognize Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. You get this from the Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada, of course. And if you would like more information, you can always just go directly to the source there at NATO. That allows us to move into the Middle East. We'll actually start up here in Kazakhstan and work our way over to the south and then back up, where we see that Kazakhstan is making fun of their new immigrants. After years of mistreatment, tables have kind of turned. Kazakhstan, which is a former Soviet republic, was really mistreated under the Soviet Union, of course, as they were considered second-class citizens or a second-class republic. Now that Russian citizens are fleeing to Kazakhstan, this chocolate factory sees an opportunity to mug them. What is this? The Russian tourist says. This is the taste of freedom.
Что это?
Это вкус свободы. Шоколад казахстанский. Почувствуй вкус свободной земли.
Nice. We jump down here into Israel, where Israel might supply missiles if Iran is supplying Russia. The head of the Israeli National Security Headquarters, Eyal Hulada, warned Russia against the purchasing of Iranian ballistic missiles at a forum in Bahrain, reported by CAN 11. Israel may supply high-precision ballistic missiles to Ukraine if Russia gets Iranian ones. You see old tensions flaring up in the middle of this. This is also reported by the Euromaidan Press. We come up into northern Syria, where unfortunately we do look at the results of recent Turkish strikes. Local sources have begun to count the dead and state that according to preliminary data, 6 members of the PKK and 6 soldiers of the Syrian army were killed and another 17 people were injured. Leader of the SDS, Syrian PKK, Muslim Abdi, said that the bombing of territories controlled by Kurdish forces is to the detriment of the entire region, and in the event of an active conflict, this will affect everyone. He also urged residents of these territories not to leave their homes and to follow the safety rules. Turkey announced that their air raid was an air operation Claw Sword and was intended to weaken the PKK forces in Syria and Iraq in order to prevent new terrorist attacks by Kurdish forces in Turkey. Turkey announcing that during their air raids, 89 PKK facilities were destroyed and a number of their leaders were killed. At the moment, it is known that 3 commanders of the Kurdish formations who died during the raids in Syria. The operation was monitored by the head of the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff of Turkey. In addition to the Kurdish, the Syrian military was also hard hit, according to reports, 14 soldiers and officers killed among them. Total number of losses is still being calculated. Coming from the Turkish Ministry of Defense was carried out. Yep, normal thing coming from the Turks. See it once again here. PKK has acknowledged that the death of 11 of its commanders, rank and file members, and a media worker as a result of the Turkish Air Force bombing. We move up here into Duhok, where we see that 4 people were killed in a gas explosion. At least 4 people were killed and 30 injured when a gas explosion ripped through a bakery located above the student dormitory in Iraq's Duhok province. Duhok governor reported that some of the victims were heavily injured and the death toll is expected to climb. One of the killed was a police officer. Health officials in Iraq's Kurdish Regional Government, or KRG, said the injured have been hospitalized. Last week, 14 people also died to a gas leak explosion in Suleimani. Coming from Kurdistan 24. You can see some of the footage coming from this explosion at the bakery. We got Yes, different angles here apparently coming in. Once again, this is coming from Kurdistan 24.
و همین مانا به درگه ما چیل بیت سا ها سراف سیستم غازه سحکه بو خبصا که عجیب ویره بس باباش بی الحمدلله همین بسلامتنو چوب سری کسی شناد هزار جا الحمدلله سحکه اوه همین طالبانا دوی قسم
وای خوده 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 وای وای سلام سلام
If you want more information, you can go to AA.com and or Kurdistan24.net. JL asked, what's your opinion about Turkey and the reactions to the Russian invasion? I don't like the fact that Turkey plays both sides. I understand that they were instrumental in creating the Grand Corridor, but and that's a good thing that it has happened, right? Like, we're talking about a high level amount of collateral hunger and repercussions for millions of people around the world. However, Turkey also cooperates with the Russians in other aspects, and this is something that's kind of a point that's heating up, is in Syria, where they were supposed to have cooperation with the Russians in Syria because they're operating specifically in the same kind of zones. Turkey hasn't really stuck in any kind of hardline stance against Russia. Turkey's already an outlier in NATO, and they continue only to create themselves even more of an outlier, not just culturally, but by their policy decisions. They are pursuing ethnic groups based off of their ethnicity and declaring them essentially terrorist organizations through affiliations for small sects of society, which have caused terrorism and security concerns of legitimacy inside of their country, specifically the Kurds, which Ottoman Turks have constantly oppressed. But they already were an outlier. Then Russia invades, and while they provide the TB2 Bayraktar drone, they're not hindering progress made by NATO, despite being a NATO member. They're not helping either. And there's actually accusations that Turkey is actually assisting Russia with, probably for some financial gains, as they do have, basically Turkey is the country that sells guns to both sides, if that makes sense. Like Turkey sells Maxim machine guns, and they sell them to both sides, essentially, is how that goes. Not directly, right? Like, they're providing military aid to Ukraine in limited number, but they're not stopping the Russians. There's actually accusations that Turkey may be assisting Russia in bypassing sanctions. In fact, they've outright stated in many ways that they will not implement NATO sanctions as a NATO member state. If there was one country that would actually break away from NATO, it's 100% going to be Turkey. 100%. It won't be Lithuania. It won't be Latvia. It won't be Poland. No, not any of these countries. Nope. It will be Turkey. And Turkey is more or less, while they say that they're aligned with NATO ideology, Recep Erdogan has basically strengthened his fist on power inside of Turkey, has continued to crack down and continued Ottoman Turkish national fanaticism to an extent, which has led to the persecution of other ethnic minority groups, including the Kurds, but also several others. They refuse to admit the Armenian genocide. They refuse to do a lot of things. And it has just led to them not having great foreign relations, period, with anyone other than really Russia. In fact, they are the country holding up Finland and Sweden from becoming members of NATO. And I'm sorry, but I would rather drop Turkey as a member of NATO and have Finland and Sweden. Like, I would rather, like, if I had to pick, like, yeah, see ya, Turkey. Like, that's great. We didn't want to sell you F-16s for a reason anyway. Like, there's a reason for that. But Turkey's in a strategic location and always has been. So they're a ally more for their strategic location, being close to the Caucasus, than they really are anything else. But yeah, they're extremely frustrating to work with, and as a result, they are. Yes, JL puts it pretty well. Playing softball to benefit from both parties as much as possible. Pretty much. Yeah, that's pretty much how that goes. Turkey is an outlier. They persecute people. They do really terrible things. And yeah, they don't play very nicely without anyone else in NATO. Turkish people in general don't have a problem with them. Their government 100% have a problem with them and their military decisions. Like, why would you, like, they oppress people to oppress people. They do the same thing the Russians do in many ways. It's absolutely infuriating to me. It's infuriating. There's nothing wrong with the Kurds. I don't understand it. They're not the only ones. They're getting it from, the Kurds are getting it from both sides. They're getting it from Turkey, and then now they're also getting it from Iran, which brings us into the next point, which is Erbil was bombed very heavily. So the Iranian armed forces again fired at objects of Kurdish groups which Tehran considers terrorists. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, targeted training camps and buildings belonging to Iranian Kurdistan Democratic Party, or the KDPK, in the Iraqi province of Erbil. For strikes, the military used several Shahed 131 and 136 kamikaze UAVs and rockets. One supporter of the DPIK was killed in the impact, and in the settlement there was temporary power outage.
أخاتم بوشو أي بابا أي بي أخلاقنا أي بي شرفنا تخواو أخلاق بوشو والله رجو زليل ليدا ديدا رجوان زليل صاروخ دي تتأجرش فيها.
You can see some of the view from that blast over there. So you kind of can get the idea. It's pretty horrendous how much they've been bombed. Also, don't forget that there's also a U.S. military installation and the consulate in Erbil too, that were also attacked by Iran 2 years ago. Yeah. U.S. CENTCOM, or U.S. Central Command Commander General Michael Eric Kurilla, condemns the Iranian cross-border and drone strikes near Erbil, adding such indiscriminate and illegal attacks place civilians at risk. Coming from the United States Central Command, statement regarding Iranian strikes near Erbil, Iraq. Statement from General Michael Eric Kurilla. U.S. CENTCOM commander. Quote, "We condemn this evening's Iranian cross-border missile and unmanned aerial vehicle strikes against Erbil, Iraq. Such indiscriminate and illegal attacks place civilians at risk, violate Iraqi sovereignty, and jeopardize the hard-fought security and stability of Iraq and the Middle East." Keep in mind, Iran and Iraq do not necessarily have great relations. In fact, under Saddam Hussein and under the Tehran's regime, they fought a very, very long war throughout the 80s in which heavy amounts of chemical weapons were actually used against another, especially on the part of Iraq. Barbara Christina says, "Why on earth was Turkey accepted into NATO and the EU?" Turkey is strategically important because of its location. First of all, Istanbul here, you have a nice little canalway that connects both the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea, and therefore also the Mediterranean. So it's a very key point here. You have the Anatolian Plain, and then you have, of course, the offshoot here. So it's very strategic in its placement. And then you also see right here, these are known as the Caucasus. The Caucasus are a very oil-rich area. In fact, when you're talking about the invasion of when you're talking about the Caucasus and the invasion of Operation Barbarossa by the part of the Germans in 1941. Operation Barbarossa, one of the points is the Army Group South. I believe it was the 7th Corps. Their whole point was to the Battle of Stalingrad occurred because 6th Corps went into Stalingrad while 7th Corps into basically take up and become a fixing force for the large amount of Russian troops because Hitler knew that Stalin would defend his namesake to no end, and which is what the case was. So while 6th Corps became a fixing force for the Nazis, the 7th Corps moved south in order to capture the Caucasus, but were bogged down because they stretched out their supply lines, and they didn't have enough supplies in order to last through the long duration of the offensive, as was initially. It was initially expected to be a very fast invasion, in which it was not. So they ended up running out of supplies and never ended up making it to the Caucasus before they ran out, and they overstretched their supply lines. And then by then the winter ends up starting to kick in, and the Battle of Stalingrad becomes double encirclement. Very hard fought battle, but a double encirclement no less, because 7th Corps isn't then rediverted to the north up to Stalingrad. So the Caucasus are extremely important. They're very oil rich. They're a resource rich area. Lots of oil reserves, and therefore Turkey is extremely close to those Caucasus and are able to go, and you would be able to have NATO forces be able to push into the Caucasus, take over that oil-rich area, and then deny the Russians the capability of using it in any kind of a war footing, which in an all-out war, conventional war between NATO and Russia, that's very important. We can see that oil supplies and therefore fuel and refinery reserves ended up playing a huge part in why Russia's war, or why the German war effort actually ended up breaking down as quickly as it did. They didn't have enough fuel and oil to run their own vehicles, which is why Hitler knew he had to take that objective, but failed to do so. So that's why it's so important. Turkey is strategically important in its location. It's close to a lot of aligned countries with Russia, and at the time of NATO's creation, the Soviet Union. So that's really where you're seeing it. That's really what you're seeing there, is strategic placement, less so of a mutual security benefit, and not so much because they get along, especially culturally. JL asks, JL ends up asking Paul why Western countries aren't playing harder with Iran. Well, Iran is an interesting nut to crack. Well, luckily I have a little bit of experience in this. Iran has been played hard with. So the issue is that they don't necessarily play the way you think they play. So I've talked a little bit about this. but I haven't probably gone into a lot of detail, but maybe it's worth going into some detail about. So, when I went to Syria on my first deployment, there was about 70,000 Iranian fighters that were in Syria. There's definitely more now. And what they go there for, it's a lot of IRGC, it's a lot of pro-popular mobilization forces. They go there and they support the Assad regime, which is supported by Russia. Normally, Russia is a big contributor to Iran. In fact, the Iranian nuclear program that they continue to run is completely ran by Russian nuclear scientists, not by Iranians. And that information was actually very publicly leaked by an Iranian revolutionary hacking organization. They publicly were able to hack into the system and get all the information regarding their nuclear program and released it publicly. Pretty awesome to read. Huge amount of information, gigabytes worth of information. Very difficult to actually sit down and read through it, especially if you don't understand it like I do. But that's why there's a lot of intelligent people who go to school for that. Regardless, tactical situation on the ground for Iran, their methodology is not to put themselves into direct conflict. Overall, Iran would lose a direct conflict with, say, the United States by itself, let alone a coalition. Iran's very heavily sanctioned. In fact, they have a weapons delivery embargo against them. They have sanctions into the Stone Age. In fact, Iran, before Russia invaded Ukraine, Iran, I would say, was the most sanctioned country in the world. It's taken a huge economic toll on the country, and as a result, for so many years of sanctions against Tehran, their people have unfortunately suffered, and that's really where you start seeing a lot of the fissures in the backing of the regime and of the Ayatollah, who is the supreme leader of Iran. They have a parliament, they have a prime minister, they have a president, and above that, they are a theocracy, which is Shia. They are the Shia sect of Islam. And they are run by the supreme leader, which is a religious leader called the Ayatollah, which was installed in the 1979 revolution in Iran. So, in comes the invasion of Iraq. It kicks Saddam Hussein out of power in 2003. What you end up having is a power vacuum, and certain individuals start popping up. Mostly you have a bunch of terrorist organizations and small revolutionary groups that are completely outclassed by an Iranian-backed fighter named al-Zarqawi. Al-Zarqawi really took over parts of Baghdad and Fallujah and other areas of Iraq in 2004. He was later killed by coalition forces. But he is the one who founds his movement. Zarqawi's movement was so bad that even Al-Qaeda, who he had worked for prior to that, actually disowned him. He was so brutal, Al-Qaeda couldn't even handle his ideology, and they disowned him. And so, but his movement is his direct descendant of his movement is the Islamic State. Most of his fighters were Iranian trained. The IRGC and the Quds Force specifically, who was led by General Qassam al-Soleimani, are the ones who taught a lot of these insurgency movements how to make IEDs, or improvised explosive devices, and even more deadly IEPs, or improvised explosive projectiles, shape charges which could penetrate American armor and cause significant casualties. Likewise, they also back Shia clerics in this country, such as Muqtada al-Sadr, who we have seen multiple times here. He is in charge of the Mahdi Army and another group called the Peace Brigades. He's heavily backed by popular mobilization forces, also Iranian trained, like Kataib Hezbollah, which actually attacked the U.S. Embassy compound on New Year's of 2020 and has conducted multiple different types of attacks against American forces in the past, which is why we've bombed them so many times. So Kataib Hezbollah is a popular mobilization forces. There's a number of them, and they're all Iranian backed. And basically, you have the Iranian backed popular mobilization forces. They feed off of the Shia groups inside of Iraq. They back these Shia militia groups, and they are constantly trying to overthrow the Iraqi government in order to destabilize Iraq, because their biggest their biggest adversary is not the United States, though they hate us quite significantly. Their government does, but they hate Saudi Arabia even more. That's why Iran ships a bunch of weapons and equipment to Yemen to back the Houthi rebels, and they toppled the government there because it's right underneath Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia put in a coalition and have lost a lot of troops there and are dedicated militarily to Yemen. So it's Iran's way of indirectly fighting Saudi Arabia and the Saudi Arabian army by training and funding and backing these troops. And that's why we seize shipments of Iranian weaponry. Saudi Arabia is Sunni, a different sector of Islam, and they are Sunni. They believe they have their own ideology of Sharia law, which both countries follow. But Saudi Arabia has a different type of Sharia law called Wahhabism that they follow, and that is where their differences in ideologies clash. It's the two sectors of Islam based off of religious lines fighting each other. The fact is that we have played much tougher. We killed General Qassam al-Soleimani. It was amazing to watch, and the only thing that sucks about killing him is we couldn't do it twice. But the reality is that they don't use standard forces to do this. They are using terrorist organizations that they are funding and training and providing the equipment and money and weaponry for, and they're funneling fighters into other places and other countries, which is why the U.S. maintains a presence in Jordan. Because if you notice, there's a huge major highway, Highway 1, which essentially runs all the way from Iran into Syria, and then also into Lebanon to fire on the other most hated country in the Middle East, which is Israel. So that kind of gives you a whole general idea as to why Iran's bad. They're constantly trying to destabilize the region, is what the problem is. They're funneling money and time and equipment and backing these very extreme ideologies and anyone that opposes them, especially the United States and the U.S. forces, which is entirely what they are against. Hence the 1979 revolution, where you see Iran going from this really advanced progressive society in the world, looking pretty much like the United States and the Middle East, to having morality police beat women to death in the streets and massacring their own people, which we're getting ready to get into. So that's the whole Iran situation. That's why things are the way they are. But the Iran and how its military is set up, they use a lot of fast attack boats, which are very difficult for large warships to deal with. And so that makes it very difficult in the Persian Gulf, because it makes it very difficult because they could basically swarm attack a U.S. ship. So it makes a landing force, which it would have to essentially be an amphibious landing in the Middle East or in Iran. And then there's a lot of mountainous terrain, especially in the south. So while it would be a successful endeavor to actually invade and destroy the Iranian government and Iranian military forces, you would deal with a course in insurgency by the IRGC, which have already planned for that for decades now. But you would also be losing a lot of American troops, because it would be a very bloody endeavor. Because while they can't make precision-guided munitions quite to the same scale that the United States can, Iran is very competent at building basic-level munitions, which is why they are able to provide things like the Shaheed 131s, the Fatah 110s, and other equipment that they have within their own arsenals, and they also provide to other groups. They're competent at being an arms manufacturer, just not to the same degree as, say, the United States is, with precision and complexity, but they can do stuff much more to a degree that you would expect from, say, like Russia or China. That kind of similar ballpark in their arms manufacture capability, and it's still very decent equipment, and we've seen it produce very effective results on the battlefield from the Iranians, from who they have supplied and funded. In fact, Ukraine is using Iranian weapons that have been seized by the United States in their shipments, including mortar systems, which we've actually aired out here on the program. So, because we have them, so we might as well give them to Ukraine, and they are used as effectively in combat as any other weapon system we've provided. So that's I hope that gives like a lot of context that probably not a whole lot of people care about, but that's pretty much the situation with Iran and the Middle East, and why things are not necessarily fantastic, and why we don't go harder on them, because it would be a bloody endeavor to do so. Because we've gone about as far as we could without going to war with Iran as physically possible, to include not killing all of them when they bombed several bases, including Al-Assad and Erbil. Because we very, very well could have. We could have annihilated Tehran off the face of the earth doing that, but we didn't. Anyway, we move on into Iran now. Iranian security forces massacre their own people. I hate this government. Iranian security forces staged a massacre in the cities of Javanurud and Piranshar in western Azerbaijan. According to reports, additional IRGC forces arrived in the cities, and in Javanurud, they opened fire on houses at night to intimidate them. In the morning, they began to shoot protesters. In Piranshar, they opened fire on the morning ceremony of the protesters. Earlier in the city of Mahabad, where locals started fighting with the police, IRGC units also entered, killing at least 35 people to suppress protests. In total, at least 419 people have been killed by security forces since the beginning of the anti-government unrest across Iran. More than 14,000 have been arrested and could face execution.
ما ترسل ما ترسل داي كنجل
So that's the situation out of that area, up in basically Iranian Kurdistan, which once again they are also very hateful against the Kurds. And they have been massacring their own people. We're starting to see more of an insurgency starting to take place, where people are getting, because of the crackdown by the government, things are escalating on the protester side as well. Now we're seeing things kind of starting to move into possibly an armed revolt and revolution inside of Iran on that factor too. Protests do continue against the Iranian regime. People from the Iranian regime came to Burkai school to perform and started insulting them, starting beating 13 and 14-year-old girls. They beat the girl in the face and pulled her hair and kicked them in the stomach. The parents went to school in protest.
زده کی زدهش کی زدهش آخونده زده خدا لعنت کنه دیگه دخترها چیکار کرده من که دخترم گفتم چند وقت نرسم مدرسه ایرانی رسن خود دختر ایرانیه و چه میگن افغانی رسن
The inscription "Death to a Dictator" on a billboard of the this is the inscription of "Death to a Dictator" on a billboard above the Satari Expressway in Tehran. Junior students chant, "We don't need infanticide." Death to the dictator. The regime has killed over 40 children in the last 2 months. So protests do continue and to include all ages. Down here in Qatar, protests continue abroad as well. Iran's football team refuses to sing the anthem of Iran and protests against their government. Iranian TV cut the segment out to avoid showing it to their citizens. Sorry, guys. So, children in Yemen demand truce. Save the Children reported that children in Yemen are demanding warring parties recommit and to preventing attacks and violence against civilians in this World Children's Day, as the conflict escalates with an average of 1 child killed or injured every day this year. Some children reported constant fear after the 6-month UN-led truce ended this October. Children who attended a workshop in Tays are calling decision makers and humanitarian actors to consider this. 1, prioritizing protecting children from violence and abuse. Ensure schools and hospitals are protected from attacks. And 3, mediate a nationwide extended truce that paves the way for lasting peace. If you want more, you can go to reliefweb.international. I apologize that I was on mute. I am also not the smartest cookie in the jar, that's for sure. Come over here into China, where out of the Wenfang district of Henan, China, 36 people were killed due to a fire in a factory. State media reported that 36 people had died due to a fire at a factory in the Chinese city of Anyang in the Henan province. The location is the high-tech zone of the Anyang city. It is reported that the fire started November 21st afternoon and controlled by 8 p.m. local time and was completely extinguished by 11 p.m. local time. 2 others are injured and 2 were reported missing. We come down here and into Indonesia over by Jakarta, where a major earthquake killed at least 162 people. The 5.6 magnitude, 10 kilometer or 6 mile deep shallow quake hit Sinjar town of West Java on November 21st. Landslides were reported. Many public facilities were damaged. The governor of West Java reported 162 deaths with thousands who were injured and 13,000 displaced. Many villages have not been evacuated yet, so death tolls could still rise. And Save the Children reported that 50 education centers were damaged with at least one teacher and one student killed. And the agency is sending emergency response team to the area. At least 25 aftershocks have so far been reported, coming from BBC World we have here.
Dari Desa Padaluyu, Kecamatan Cugenang, sana banyak rumah yang hancur, memerlukan alat berat, dan juga banyak jalan-jalan yang terputus sehingga kami terputus. Nah, kondisi sekarang saya sedang menginventarisasi, dan juga tidak sedikit warga yang meninggal.
Also coming from Nexta, we can see some of the photos of the destruction here as first responders going through. Coming from AP, the Associated Press, and Reuters.
Allah, hancur bangunan, runtuh sedayana ya Allah. Masyarakat kampung Sebetir, runtuh bumi ya Allah. Ya Allah, ya Allah, gempa. Ya Allah, ya Rasulullah. Masyarakat.
Ayo, ambulan ya Allah. Ambulan ya Allah. Ambulan mana ambulan bro. Ambulan ya Allah ya Rabbi.
Saya jalan aja Pak.
Ya Allah. Ambulan. Ayo ambulan. Itu hancur.
SaveChildren.org is also having an emergency donation for this as well. So if you guys want to jump onto that, please feel free to do so. The link is also on the map. Jump over into Africa, where we see that dengue fever and malaria are on the rise. The head of North Darfur Emergency Committee reported that 315 out of 592 suspected cases of dengue fever tested positive. 153 cases were under examination and 8 were hospitalized. A child just recently died, suspecting due to dengue fever. Local public health specialists also reported 8,861 cases of malaria, with 12 deaths recorded in each of the 3 localities, El Fasher, El Layet, and El Tina. Recent floods have allowed diseases transmitted by mosquitoes to spread faster, as post-flood conditions are ideal for the animals who lay their eggs on the surface of stagnant waters. If you want more information on that, please go check out Relief Web, the International, who have an article on that. Go over to the border between Burkina Faso and Mali, where the Islamic State and JNIM ended up fighting. The Islamic State announced clashes with Al-Qaeda militants and JNIM in the border areas of Mali and Burkina Faso, and the statement said JNIM militants attempted to attack Islamic State-controlled territory on November 12th, but were rebuffed, losing more than 80 of their members and another 10 falling into the hands of the Islamic State jihadists, who subsequently executed them. In addition, ISIS forces managed to destroy several vehicles belonging to them, capturing 6 more with a large amount of weapons and ammunition as a trophy. We do see that statement from the Islamic State. Yes, once again, like I said, just like Al-Qaeda did disown al-Zarqawi, they still have never gotten along. Al-Qaeda and ISIS fight, the Taliban and ISIS fight. Nobody likes ISIS but ISIS. Even terrorist organizations hate ISIS. They are too extreme for extremist organizations. If that blows your mind, I don't know what will when it comes to how bad the Islamic State is. But the Islamic State is bad. It is terrible. It is unbelievably atrocious. They are especially heinous. Over here, this is coming from Medellin here in Colombia. There was a plane crash in a Colombian neighborhood. A small plane crashed Monday in a neighborhood in central Colombian city of Medellin, killing 8 people on board, airport authorities said. No injuries were immediately reported on the ground. 7 homes were destroyed and 6 other buildings damaged. The exact cause of the crash is not yet determined. Medellin Mayor Daniel Quintero said in a statement that the aircraft experienced an engine failure during takeoff. It seems to just be the same video repeating there. We can get some other shots of the firefighters here as they're going through the cleanup efforts. We jump up into North America, where we have several different developments. We start off here over in Halifax, where Canada's Minister of Defense joined weaving of net for Ukrainian defenders. Canada's Minister of Defense, Anita Anand, joined a net weaving event held in the International Security Forum in Halifax. The camouflage net will be handed over to Ukrainian defenders. And she did go through and end up weaving on a little bit of that camouflage net there. They are, you don't think that they would be that good, but they actually are pretty impressive at how well they actually camouflage vehicles and personnel. We actually did it. I never thought this, but because I always thought it was pretty stupid, but even but they break up the silhouette of the vehicle, the really hard edges of the vehicle. And one time I saw our own vehicles during a training range. We covered our vehicles. We dug them into vehicle defensive positions for Humvees, and then we covered them with camouflage netting. And I got to see images from a drone that was flying overhead of us, and you couldn't even tell that we even existed there, really. It was very difficult to tell exactly where our defensive line is. They are amazingly good at a distance, and that's what they're meant for. Coming from the UN headquarters, yesterday specifically, November the 20th, is World Children's Day, which is celebrated on November 20th each year to promote international awareness on the improvement of children's welfare. The theme of 2022's World Children's Day is inclusion for every child. We get this coming from UNICEF.
This is my team. And we have one dream.
Chúng ta cùng đoàn kết vì mọi trẻ em. Let's come together for every child.
Să комусь по educație пушаcă.
Por la salud mental de la infancia.
Нам потрібен мир для кожної дитини.
Igualdad para la infancia.
এটি এমন একটা দল যাকে আমরা সবাই সাপোর্ট করতে পারি
Esse é o meu time.
This is my team.
To jest moja drużyna. Let's see your support.
This is the team we can all get behind.
让我们嫌弃丑来，为了每一名儿童。
আর নয় বিভেদ, আর নয় বৈষম্য.
There can only be one team when it comes to children's rights.
Join us.
That's coming from UNICEF for every child. And UNHCR, our Human Rights Council, also posted something on World Children's Day. Let's ensure that every child has a birth certificate. Without one, stateless people struggle to get an education, find work, travel, vote, or even receive health care. If you want more information, you can go into the UN.org and check out their observances for World Children's Day. Back up in Ontario, back up here in Ontario, Canada, coming out of Toronto, there was a $500 million bond launched. Canada launched the $500 million Ukraine sovereignty bond for Canadians to purchase, which will help provide essential services to Ukrainians this winter. If you want more information, or if you're a Canadian interested in getting a bond, then you can go to canada.ca English or French or whatever it is for you guys, Department of Finance, and they have a whole thing here. Or you can just jump onto the map and click this link. They have more information for you. It's very similar to war bonds. If you ever heard of war bond sales for the United States during World War II and other times of war, very similar ideology to that. You're loaning the money to the government, which will be paid back with interest. On a more solemn note, as we wrap up North America here, coming out of Colorado Springs, unfortunately, a gunman ended up killing 5 at an LGBTQ plus nightclub there in Colorado Springs. A 22-year-old gunman entered an LGBTQ nightclub in Colorado Springs, Colorado, just before midnight Saturday and immediately opened fire, killing at least 5 people and injuring 25 others before patrons confronted and stopped him. The suspect in the shooting at Club Q was identified as Anderson Lee Aldrich, according to Colorado Springs Police Chief Adrian Vasquez. He used a long rifle in the shooting, and 2 firearms were found at the scene. Going to the police department regarding identifying those who were killed. And memorials are already being set up, of course, there at the scene. And so with that, we move on to something to try and brighten the mood a little bit, considering all the rather terrible things that we've talked about today. And we have a couple of very interesting topics for you guys. We start off over here. This is coming out of Papua New Guinea, out of Ferguson Island, where we see that researchers find a large pigeon that has been lost to science for 140 years. After 140 years, a pigeon subspecies lost to science has been found again on Ferguson Island off of eastern Papua New Guinea. Using a remote camera trap, researchers photographed the black-naped pheasant pigeon, or Otidifaps nobilis insularis, a large ground-dwelling bird for the first time since it was described in 1883. Quote, after a month of searching, seeing those first photos of the pheasant pigeon felt like finding a unicorn, said John C. Mittermeier, director of the Lost Birds program at the American Bird Conservancy and co-leader of the expedition. It is the kind of moment you dream about your entire life as a conservationist and a bird watcher. And we get to take a look at this adorable little guy here. There, it is essentially a cross between a pheasant and a pigeon. Kind of cool. Kind of adorable, not gonna lie. And then we jump over here. Thanks. I appreciate making things more difficult for me, Riley, for when it comes to pronunciation, knowing how atrocious it is. We jump over here, and we jump over to Mission Control out of NASA, where Artemis has flown by the moon. Passing behind the moon right before signal loss. We have a couple of photos coming here. So this is right before signal loss. It is slingshotting its way around the moon, and you can see Earth all the way over there. That tiny little blip in the distance. But here's Artemis 1 right before it lost signal as it passed around the moon. Obviously, this probably isn't going to have any sound with it. Not that there's a whole lot of sound in space. And bloop. Loss of signal. Shot of the Earth kiss of the moon. There you go. That nice little, just a little peck on the cheek. Shot of when Orion kissed the moon. Within 80 miles of the lunar surface, this is the closest uncrewed mission ever done. Spectacular photographs of the lunar surface coming in. This is the 6th day of flight here from the moon. And they said Snoopy is in. So you can see Snoopy floating around up there. It's good to always see a sense of humor. There you go. That is Snoopy as he is flying around in zero gravity. While they are... So Snoopy serves the Artemis says Snoopy serves a very important purpose during the Artemis 1 mission. He is our zero-G indicator, meaning that his flotation indicates microgravity levels on board the NASA Orion spacecraft. So he's a soft object that wouldn't damage anything inside the aircraft. And they can tell they can tell where the gravity is and everything else because of where he is floating, just randomly floating around the airframe, which is kind of cool. Keep in mind, so the whole point of Artemis 1, it's an uncrewed mission. I know it looks like there's a person here. That's just the suit. They're testing everything, the spacesuit, the internal components. They're testing everything to the maximum extent that they physically can on this airframe. I say airframe, on this spaceship, essentially. To ensure that they are, here, you want up? To ensure that they are actually ensuring that it will be safe when it's crewed. Oh, no. I guess Tally didn't want to be on camera today. Apologize. Tally was sitting here by my side. Come here. No? You just want to lick yourself? Okay. Sorry, I was trying to give you cat. I was trying to give you guys what the internet was made for, but it's... Fortunately, the cat is not cooperating. It's okay. It happens. But pretty cool. So I'm happy to see more updates coming from Artemis 1. Artemis 1 is a very historic mission as we get ready to move back to the moon. And now Artemis 2 will be up next once this mission is completed. Artemis 2 will be a manned mission. It will be the manned mission, but they will be going around the moon. They will not be landing on the moon during that mission. It is a flyby. And then finally, Artemis 3, we should see a landing on the moon, and we should see the first people on the moon in really 60 years. So pretty awesome to think about, and pretty awesome to be able to get to see that, because it's not something I thought I would see in my lifetime. I thought it was over, but yeah, so pretty cool. And that actually completes all of the news for the night. So I hope that while you may not have enjoyed a lot of the topics, I hope that you found this knowledgeable and informative. And I hope that you now have a better understanding of what's happening in the world around you, and in kind of some of the intricacies of it as best as I could explain, and some of my personal opinions on the matter. But keep in mind the whole point of the project. And the whole point of the project is to help people. A lot of these people are suffering, whether you're talking about the earthquake that happened in Indonesia, you're talking about the war in Ukraine, you're talking about what's happening in the Middle East, you're talking about the Horn of Africa. No matter where you're talking, there's people, unfortunately, that are suffering. We here at the New News don't believe in profiting off of other people's misery. We don't make a dime off of this. We never want to. We never intend to. Never merchandising, never doing any super chats, never monetizing any of this. 100% of everything we do is in support of charities and is charity-driven work. So, yes, there's Tally and all of her glory. So please be sure to give to the wonderful organizations listed in the description below, and give as much support as you can to them. Please, 80% or more of all the donations they receive go directly to their programs. We can go to help people instead of salaries and administration's costs. If you have more, please send them to us. You can get a hold of myself on our Discord or on our Twitter or on anywhere else that we have listed. All of the links are in the description. And if you have, and if you can't give lots of these organizations, give a little. If you can't give anything at all, that's okay. Help us grow our impact and grow how many people are part of this. That way we are able to do more and help more people throughout the world. And with that, thank you guys for joining us. I hope to see you once again on Wednesday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. Central for another 48 hours of news and review. In the meantime, I hope you'll be safe. I hope that you, your family, and your friends are safe. And if not, I do hope that you guys find that safety and security in the very near future. In the meantime, you guys have a fantastic night. My name is Paul, and I hope to see you back here on the New News. Night, everybody.
Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріляно волновахи, і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Нам не треба ні конфлікту, ні війни. Та ми готові всіх вас звать до сатани. Тисячі вже полягло, і все більше шлепуйло. То для них нема нічого, крім труни. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріля до волновахи, і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Вызволять пришел, братишка, ну привет. На моей земле тебе один ответ. Нашим людям печем, даже танки и бачок. Вам не взять нас и за 100 000 лет. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріля до волновахи, і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО.
Mr. Putin, on behalf of all our guys, no one's scared of your nuclear device. You can take your top 11, shove it up your wrinkled bum. Oh, we'll come and help you fit it in your skull.
Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріля до волновахи, і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріля до волновахи, і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Russian soldiers going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріля до волновахи, і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Going home, Russian soldiers going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо
идите нахуй!